Well, hello everyone. This is the second day in our history book, Alexander Graham Bell, on page 305, and we're going to read to the top of page 307. Page 305. Alexander traveled to London, England, to work with his grandfather. When he was 16 years old, he became a teacher at the school for the deaf. Using the methods Alexander had learned from his father and grandfather, his students learned quickly. When he was later returned home to Scotland, his father had developed a new method of teaching the deaf how to speak. Mr. Bell used symbols to represent how a person positioned his mouth and tongue in order to make certain sounds. It was called visible speech. Alexander and his father began traveling to different cities to demonstrate his new way of teaching. A big move. Alexander's grandfather died from a lung disease called tuberculosis. Then Alexander's brothers also died from the same disease. Alexander is my only remaining son. I must do something to keep him safe, his father said. He decided to move his family from the bad air of London to the fresh, clean air of Canada. He hoped Alexander's lungs would be strong and healthy. Alexander liked Canada much better than he thought he would. While Alexander explored his new home, he met a Mohawk Indian chief that lived nearby. The Mohawk language had only been a spoken language. Alexander became friends with the chief, learned the language, and wrote it down. His friend made Alexander an honorary Mohawk chief. Life in Boston. After living in Canada for a short time, Alexander Graham Bell chose to move to America, where he lived in Boston and worked at a school for the deaf. This school had only enough money to pay him for 1 year. So now I'm at the top of page 306. When the year was over, he began to look for a new job. Mr. Bell loved Boston because it reminded him of the busy town of London where he had once lived. In his new job, he was hired to tutor several deaf children. Alexander Graham Bell also started doing experiments with sound. If the piano can make high and low sounds, could telegraph machines also send high and low sounds so that two messages could be sent at the same time? He wondered. He was going to find out. Mr. Bell began tutoring a deaf lady named Mabel Hubbard. As they got to know each other, they became good friends. Later, they were married. Mabel's father was very interested in Alexander Graham Bell's telegraph machine experiments, and he helped pay for them. Mr. Bell was able to hire Thomas Watson to help him with his work. Together, they hoped to invent their new telegraph machine before anyone else did. Instead of inventing a new kind of telegraph machine, Alexander Graham Bell accidentally invented the first telephone. He sent sound through the telegraph wire. Mr. Bell knew that he had invented something that would change the way people communicated. The men who gave him his money for his experiments decided to go ahead and make sure the ideas and design for this new invention were not stolen. They got a patent that protected Alexander Graham Bell's telephone design from being copied. Just 3 days later, Mr. Bell tested his invention. "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you," he said. Mr. Watson came running. What could be wrong? Nothing was wrong. Mr. Watson had just received the first telephone call. So now we're at Stop and Think on page 307. Alexander Graham Bell was a hard worker. While he was busy doing his job, he actually invented something better. Do you think his invention of the telephone should be called an accident? That's a good question. A lot of things have been invented in our lifetime that originally were not supposed to be what they were. Velcro, for example. Chewing gum is another one. Those two inventions were done by accident. But again, I don't know if it really was an accident. They're really trying to invent something, and in the process of trying to invent something, something else comes out. So I don't know. That's a good question. How would you answer that? Do you think his invention of the telephone should have become or be called an accident? And aren't we glad that he had this accident? Because we wouldn't be able to talk on the telephone or our cell phones or anything else we're doing right now. So I'm grateful that he had an accident and learned how to send messages over a phone. All right, I will see you tomorrow. We're going to start in the middle of page 307.